My daughter used my card for her vacation. Are you too old to travel? I didn't argue. I'm Diane, 71 years old, a widow, and a former archivist. I went to the bank in silence. The airport would give her a surprise. The heat of our coastal city always has a peculiar way of creeping through the windows early in the morning. It's a thick air, heavy with salt and the smell of bougainvillea, warning you that the day is going to be long. That Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my dining room table, enjoying the monotonous hum of my old ceiling fan and a cup of black coffee. My mail was stacked on the vinyl tablecloth. All my life, I was the head archivist for the county. I classified birth certificates, death notices, wills, and contracts for 40 years. To me, paper never lies. Paper is the memory of people who refuse to tell the truth to your face. With my brass letter opener, I sliced the edge of the envelope containing my bank statement. It was a monthly routine. I've always been a woman of exact numbers, clear accounts, and zero debt. My pension isn't a fortune, but over the decades I managed to save a respectable nest egg, money that was my safety net, my guarantee that in my old age I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. I unfolded the document and adjusted my glasses. My eyes scanned the columns of routine charges, the grocery store, the pharmacy, the electric bill. Everything was fine, until I reached the second page. There, printed in cold black ink, was a charge that knocked the wind right out of me. $8,000. The description clearly read, International Airlines, all-inclusive package, reservation under Barbara and family. I felt a cold pinch in my chest, right where the heart beats hardest when fear or surprise ambushes you. $8,000 was the equivalent of several years of my strictest savings. I stared at the paper for long minutes, waiting for the numbers to change, hoping it was a bank error, a glitch in the system. But my daughter's name was right there, implicitly tied to the travel agency that had processed the payment. I immediately remembered the previous Sunday. Barbara had come to visit with her 2 teenage kids and her husband, Stephen. It had been a loud, chaotic visit, like all of hers. At one point in the afternoon, she asked to borrow my purse because she needed to find an aspirin for a headache. I, trusting her, told her to grab it from my bedroom. Never, not in my darkest nightmares, did I imagine that my own daughter would use that moment to copy the numbers from my primary credit card, the one I kept for medical emergencies, or for the trip to Europe I had been planning for years. She had an authorized user card with a tiny limit that I paid off for her little emergencies, but this was different. She had used the data from my master account, where my credit limit was backed by my life savings. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. When sadness is that profound, it doesn't produce immediate tears. It produces a kind of frozen paralysis. I picked up my tortoiseshell fountain pen, the one I used for years to sign official county documents, and I drew a red circle around the charge. Then I stood up, put on my walking shoes, and grabbed my keys. I needed to hear the truth from her own mouth before taking action. Barbara's house was 15 blocks from mine, in a newer, much flashier suburban neighborhood. The walk under the mid-morning sun was pure torture, but my legs kept moving, propelled by a mix of disbelief and bottled-up rage. When I reached her door, I didn't ring the bell. I used the spare key she herself had given me for when she needed me to house-sit. I stepped into the hallway and immediately caught the scent of expensive sunscreen and new plastic. In the middle of the living room sat 3 brightly colored hard-shell suitcases, wide open. Barbara was folding designer swimsuits and lightweight evening dresses. Her husband, Stephen, was reviewing some travel documents on the coffee table. "Hi, Mom," Barbara said, seeing me without flinching much, though I noticed a slight hardening in her jaw. "What are you doing here so early? You didn't say you were coming." I walked slowly until I was standing right in front of her. My breathing was measured, controlled. I pulled the bank statement from my purse and dropped it onto one of the new suitcases, right on top of a beach hat. "I want you to explain this, Barbara," I said, with a voice that sounded deeper and steadier than I expected. She looked at the paper. There was no surprise in her eyes, just a rapid tactical assessment of the situation. She sighed, crossed her arms, and looked at me with an expression that blended annoyance with pure condescension. "Oh, Mom, please. Don't make a drama out of this. I was going to tell you this afternoon. It's a loan. I'm going to pay you back, little by little." "It's not a loan if you don't ask for it, Barbara. It's theft," I replied, feeling the word fill the space between us. Stephen, a coward as always, muttered some excuse about going to check the car and vanished into the garage. Don't exaggerate, she raised her voice, losing her patience instantly. You're my mother. You have all that money just sitting there, rotting in the bank. What do you even want it for? To pay doctors you don't even need yet? I am exhausted, Mom. The kids are driving me crazy. Stephen works all day. I needed this vacation. I deserve a break in a nice place, not in those filthy cabins we used to go to. That money was for my trip to Spain, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I've been planning it for 5 years. You knew that. That was when Barbara spoke the words that tore me in half, yet simultaneously handed me absolute clarity. She looked me up and down, evaluating my gray hair, my sensible shoes, my hands spotted by age and time. Mom, let's be realistic, she said, with a cruelty disguised as pity. You are way too old to travel. A 12-hour flight would destroy your back, spike your blood pressure, clog your ears. You'd end up in a hospital way over there, and it would be worse for everyone. You're just not built for that kind of action anymore. Let me enjoy it. I still have youth and energy. Just consider it an advance on my inheritance. I mean, it was going to be mine someday anyway, right? The silence that followed her statement was heavy, suffocating. I looked into her eyes and saw a stranger. I saw a selfish woman, devoured by her own inadequacies, who looked at me not as her mother, not as a person with dreams, but as a simple bank account with an expiration date. She was declaring me dead while I was still breathing. To her, my existence only had value as long as it could finance her whims. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give her a sermon about respect. Nor did I remind her of the times I skipped buying a pair of shoes so she could go to her prom in a brand new dress. That whole history, that entire archive of maternal sacrifices, burned to ash the second she justified her theft with my old age. I understand. It was the only thing that left my lips. Barbara blinked, confused by my lack of resistance. She expected screaming. She expected me to demand she cancel everything. She expected a fight worthy of a cheap soap opera. Finding none, her face relaxed into a smile of relief and triumph. Thanks, Mommy. I knew you'd understand. I'll bring you a beautiful souvenir from Maui. I promise. We leave tomorrow, first thing in the morning. I nodded slowly. I picked up my bank statement from on top of her suitcase, folded it with surgical precision, and tucked it back into my purse. I turned around and walked toward the door. Have a good day packing, Barbara, I told her without looking back, and I pulled the front door shut behind me. The heat of the street hit my face, but inside, I was a block of solid ice. I walked down the sidewalk under the shade of the almond trees. My archivist's mind began to process the data, separating emotions from facts, organizing the evidence, tracing the protocol to follow. When someone forges a signature or takes a document without permission in the county archive, there are immediate legal consequences. Blood ties don't excuse fraud, and my daughter had just committed a monumental fraud. I didn't head home. I changed direction at the main avenue and walked straight toward my local bank branch. The building was a modern structure of glass and steel that clashed with the rest of our coastal town. Stepping inside, the air conditioning dried the sweat on my forehead. I walked up to the ticket dispenser and pulled a number. I went to sit in the waiting chairs, keeping my back straight and my hands folded in my lap. 15 minutes later, an electronic voice announced my number. I stood up and walked to the desk at the back, where a young executive I knew by sight welcomed me with a professional smile. His name was Ezekiel. He was a polite kid, always sharp in his gray suit. Good morning, Diane. How can I help you today? He asked, typing his password into the computer. Good morning, Ezekiel. I need to file a charge dispute for unauthorized use and fraud, and proceed with the immediate cancellation of all my plastic, including the authorized user cards, I said, using the exact same tone I'd used to ask for a pound of tomatoes at the market. Ezekiel stopped his hands over the keyboard and looked at me with concern. Fraud? Did someone steal your card, Diane? They stole my data, Ezekiel. There is an $8,000 charge that I did not authorize, a purchase from a travel agency and an airline. The young man frowned and quickly pulled up my profile. I could see the reflection of the screen in his glasses. His face paled slightly when he confirmed the amount. Here it is. Yes, a charge processed 3 days ago. Diane, The system indicates the purchase was made online, using the security code from your main card. But the passenger names are your daughter's and her family. I cut him off. That's correct. She took my card details without my consent. Ezekiel swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable, being caught in the crossfire of a family conflict. Diane, if the bank initiates a fraud investigation and the charge is reversed, the travel agency and the airline will not receive the payment. That means the tickets and the hotel reservations will be automatically canceled by the service provider. I perfectly understand the consequences, Ezekiel, I replied, pulling out my ID and placing it on his desk. I want to start the process. I do not recognize that charge. My daughter had no authorization to use that line of credit. Are you sure? Ezekiel lowered his voice, trying to be empathetic. If she shows up at the airport and the cards are blocked, or the payment has bounced, they won't let her board. It could be a very embarrassing situation. I took out my tortoiseshell fountain pen. I pulled the cap off with a smooth motion and held it ready to sign. Ezekiel, at my age, a woman learns that embarrassing situations are life's greatest teachers. Print the claim forms, please. The sound of the laser printer started humming in the quiet office. Ezekiel handed me 3 sheets with the bank's letterhead. I read every line with the same attention I used to give county contracts. Everything was in order. The bank would withhold the payment, initiate the dispute, and my money would be protected under the unauthorized use clause. The current cards would be voided that very second, and new ones would be issued that only I could pick up at the branch. I signed each page with firm strokes, my hand completely steady. My signature, large and adorned with classic flourishes, sealed the fate of Barbara's dream vacation. All set, Diane, Ezekiel said, gathering the documents. Your current cards, both the primary and the one your daughter had, are now useless. The charge has been flagged as fraudulent, and the money will not leave your account. Thank you very much, Ezekiel. You are very efficient. I gave him a sincere smile. I capped my pen and stood up. I walked out of the bank, and the midday heat embraced me again, but this time it felt comforting. I walked back to my house step by step, enjoying the sound of the birds in the trees and the bustle of the street vendors. I didn't feel sad or defeated. I felt more alive than ever. Barbara thought my life was over, that I was a dusty relic incapable of defending myself. She had mistaken a mother's love for stupidity and my old age for weakness. Tomorrow at 6 in the morning, she, her coward of a husband, and her shiny suitcases would be standing at the airline counter, ready to fly to paradise on my dime. I, on the other hand, would brew myself a good cup of coffee, turn on my fan, and sit down to wait for the phone to ring. Because paper never lies, and debts acquired through betrayal are always paid back in humiliation. I reached my house just as the sun started painting the hallway walls with that dense orange hue that precedes sweltering afternoons. I closed the front door behind me, threw the deadbolt, and stood in the foyer, listening to the silence. It was a clean, absolute silence, so different from the shrill chaos I had left at Barbara's house just a couple of hours earlier. I dropped my purse on the mahogany console table and kicked off my shoes. Feeling the cold tile floor under my bare feet has always been my way of anchoring myself to reality. I walked toward my study, the room I used to share with my late husband, which, after his passing, I transformed into my personal sanctuary. The walls are lined with shelves full of perfectly aligned folders, spines labeled with impeccable handwriting, and acid-free cardboard boxes. But my true pride isn't the paperwork. It's my collection of county rubber stamps. During my 40 years in the municipal archive, I rescued the heavy wood and brass stamps the administration threw away every time they changed the seal design or modernized a department. I have over 50 of them. Some date back to the 1930s. I walked over to the display case where I keep them. I opened the glass and picked up one in particular. Its dark wooden handle was worn smooth by the grip of countless clerks before me. On the rubber base, the inverted letters formed a definitive word. I pulled a red ink pad from my drawer, pressed the stamp into it until the rubber was soaked, and then slammed it down hard onto a blank sheet of paper on my desk. The sound was a sharp, authoritative thud. I lifted the stamp. There on the paper, in unmistakable scarlet red, read the word, denied. I stared at that word for a long time. That was exactly how I felt. Not about myself, but about my daughter. Barbara had tried to file me away, in the useless junk section, in the basement, for human beings who no longer have the right to desire, to travel, to exist beyond their financial utility. By doing so, she had personally signed the denial of her privileged place in my life. I sat down in my swivel chair and turned on the small brass lamp on my desk. It was time to assess my resources. In the county archive, I learned that no legal, bureaucratic, or personal battle is won with screaming or tears. It's won with documents, and Barbara, in her infinite arrogance, had made a monumental tactical error when she justified her theft by calling it an advance on her inheritance. That phrase echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my memory. Consider it an advance on my inheritance. By saying that, Barbara had revealed her true strategy. It wasn't just a vacation whim. In her mind, my estate already belonged to her. I was just the temporary manager of assets she was already spending on credit. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the only one I keep locked, and pulled out a thick blue binder. Inside, I keep the exact inventory of my life. The deed to this house, completely paid off and free of any liens. The certificates for my investment funds, modest but solid, which I built month by month over 4 decades of classifying other people's lives. And most importantly, a copy of my will and a durable power of attorney for legal, financial, and medical decisions. I had granted that proxy to Barbara 7 years ago, when I had my gallbladder removed and felt vulnerable for the very first time. That document was a ticking time bomb. If Barbara was capable of stealing $8,000 from me, arguing that I was too old to travel, what would stop her from using that medical proxy illegally to declare me senile or incompetent to manage my own assets, now that I had canceled her cards? Old age carries a terrible stigma. Society convinces you that after 70, your brain turns to cotton and your decisions are just the whims of a decaying mind. I leaned back in my chair and let the thought wrap around me like the heavy coastal air. It's fascinating, and at the same time terrifying, to realize the invisibility of old age. When you walk down the street with white hair and wrinkles on your face, people look at you through a filter of pity or impatience. In the grocery store, young folks talk to you louder and slower, assuming deafness and stupidity come in the same package. At the bank, they're shocked if you know how to use an ATM. You become a patronized ghost. But what Barbara didn't understand, what no one seemed to understand, is that this invisibility is an extraordinary power. It is the perfect camouflage. Nobody suspects an older woman in orthopedic shoes carrying a worn leather purse. Nobody expects that behind my reading glasses lies a mind trained to spot the slightest discrepancy in a 100-page contract. While they saw me as a dead, dusty file, I moved with the precision of a ruthless auditor. I glanced at the wall clock. It was 3 in the afternoon. I had enough time before the offices downtown closed. I picked up the landline on my desk and dialed a number I knew by heart. On the 3rd ring, a deep, raspy voice answered. Public Notary number 18. Arthur speaking. Arthur, my dear friend, it's Diane. I need to see you today. It is a matter of absolute urgency. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Arthur and I had known each other for 30 years. He drafted the wills and I filed them in the county registry. We were 2 gears in the same bureaucratic clock. Diane, for you, there's always time. What's going on? Property issues? Preventative maintenance, Arthur. I need to revoke a comprehensive power of attorney and draft an addendum to my will. I'll be at your office in 20 minutes. I didn't give him time to ask any more questions. I hung up. I tucked the blue binder into my purse, touched up my lipstick in the hallway mirror, and stepped out onto the street again. The heat had dialed back a bit, letting the sea breeze carry the smell of salt and fried fish up from the harbor. I walked the 10 blocks that separated me from downtown with a firm, rhythmic pace, dictated by the urgency of my plan. Arthur's office smelled of dark tobacco, wood wax, and old paper, a combination I always found deeply comforting. He received me in his private office, a space lined with law books and dark leather furniture. I sat across from him and, without any preamble, pulled out the binder and placed it on his desk. I want to immediately void the legal and medical power of attorney I granted to Barbara, I told him, looking him dead in the eye. And I want it registered in the state system today. If starting tomorrow she tries to make a single decision in my name, I want the system to reject her. Arthur furrowed his bushy white eyebrows and adjusted his glasses. It's a quick procedure, Diane, but I'm surprised. You always told me Barbara was your safety net. Did something serious happen? What happened is that my safety net decided to use my life savings to go to Maui, under the premise that I'm too old to enjoy my own money. If I leave her with that proxy in her hands, tomorrow she'll declare me incompetent to get back what I just blocked at the bank. Arthur sat in silence, processing the data. As a good notary, he had seen entire families tear each other to pieces over an empty lot or grandma's china, so betrayal was no stranger to him. He nodded slowly, picked up a pen, and pulled a legal pad closer. I understand perfectly. We will revoke the proxy entirely. You will now be the sole owner of your legal, financial, and medical decisions. If something happens to you, who do we name for emergencies? No one, I replied with a coldness that surprised even me. If something happens to me, let the doctors at the public hospital decide. I prefer the cold bureaucracy of the state over the warm hypocrisy of my daughter. As for the will, I want to add a life estate clause and bulletproof the house so it cannot be sold or mortgaged under any circumstances, as long as I draw breath. And the money in my accounts, well, that money is about to be significantly reduced. Arthur offered a half smile, sensing my intentions. He buzzed his assistant, dictated the terms with astonishing speed, and in less than an hour, I was signing the official revocation and the testamentary amendments. I felt a massive weight, a yoke I didn't even know I was wearing, lift off my shoulders. I was now truly untouchable. Barbara had no access to my cards, no power over my health, and no claim to my house. I had cut every single string that tied us together legally. I walked out of the notary's office just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the harbor sky in shades of violet and purple. I felt light, renewed. Rediscovered power isn't something you feel in your muscles. You feel it in your gut, like a serene fire pushing you forward. When I got back home, I turned on the living room lights and headed straight for the kitchen. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea, turned on my old transistor radio to catch some instrumental music, and sat down at my desktop computer. Yes, I'm 71, but digitizing the county archive forced me to master technology long before most women of my generation. Barbara thought I couldn't keep up, that a long flight would break me. Her cruel words had been the exact fuel I needed to stop putting my life on hold. I had been planning a trip to Spain for 5 years, tracing routes on paper maps, reading about the history of Toledo, the narrow alleys of Seville, the majesty of Madrid. 5 years of saving, waiting for the right moment, terrified of leaving my house empty, terrified that Barbara might need something while I was gone. I opened the web browser and went to the site of the exact same international airline she had used for her fraud. I selected the origin and destination, Madrid, round trip, departure date next week. I wasn't going to wait anymore. I wasn't going to give Barbara time to come crying, demanding explanations, or trying to manipulate me with guilt over the grandkids. I selected a seat in premium economy because while I don't need excessive luxury, my knees appreciate the extra legroom. The price was steep, but looking at the total on the screen, I didn't feel a single ounce of remorse. That money was mine. It was the fruit of breathing file dust for 4 decades, of enduring incompetent mayors, of waking up at dawn every single day of my adult life. I reached the payment gateway, pulled out the debit card for my secondary savings account, the one Barbara didn't even know existed, and I typed the numbers with precision. 16 digits, expiration date, security code. 1 click on the confirm button. The screen blinked for a few seconds that felt like an eternity, and then a message appeared in bright green letters. Your reservation is confirmed. Have a great trip, Diane. I printed the itinerary and placed it on my desk, right next to the bank statement showing my daughter's fraudulent charge, which I had stamped with denied. The contrast between those 2 pieces of paper was the purest poetry I had witnessed in years. One represented betrayal and selfishness. The other, my absolute freedom. I shut down the computer and went to my bedroom. I opened the closet and pulled down my brown leather suitcase. It wasn't a brightly colored, cheap plastic hard shell like the ones Barbara was packing in her living room. It was a classic piece of luggage, sturdy, weathered by the years. Exactly like me. I opened it on the bed and began pulling clothes from my drawers. Comfortable slacks, breathable linen blouses, my walking shoes with good arch support, a light coat for the European nights. As I folded each garment with care, I thought about the strategic moves I had just executed. In a single day, I had defunded an emotional extortion, bulletproofed my legal independence, and materialized my biggest dream. And I had done it in absolute silence, without raising my voice, using the system in my favor. The clock on the nightstand read 10 o'clock. I turned off the main light and slipped between the crisp cotton sheets. Outside, the coastal city was sinking into the lethargy of the night. 15 blocks away, my daughter was surely sleeping peacefully, dreaming of white sand beaches and tropical cocktails, completely oblivious to the bureaucratic hurricane looming over her. Barbara thought she held a winning hand because she was betting against an old woman she deemed docile and exhausted. She was entirely ignorant of the fact that in the game of documents and authorizations, the master of the archives always has the last word. I adjusted the pillow under my head and closed my eyes, a smile forming in the dark. All I had to do now was sleep deeply, because my daughter's flight was scheduled for the crack of dawn, and I needed to be fully rested to listen, from the comfort of my home, as her vacation crashed and burned before it even reached the runway. The grandfather clock I inherited from my grandparents struck 4:30 a.m. with its deep, measured chimes. At that hour, our coastal town is almost magical, wrapped in a salty mist that slips through the window cracks and a silence so thick you can almost touch it. Most people my age usually suffer from insomnia, tossing and turning in bed, ruminating over aching bones or past regrets. But not me. I slept my full 8 hours with a conscience as clean and organized as the files I used to classify. I got up slowly, enjoying the familiar creak of the hardwood floorboards beneath my slippers. I went to the kitchen, lit the stove, and put water to heat in my blue enamel kettle. While I patiently brewed my coffee, filtering it the old-fashioned way, I let my mind travel 12 miles down the road. At that exact moment, the corridors of the international airport had to be glaring with cold, white lights. I could picture the scene perfectly. Barbara in her oversized sunglasses, feeling like the most important woman in the world, pushing 3 gleaming suitcases, while Stephen, her husband, dragged his feet looking half asleep, and the kids walked hunched over their cell phones. I poured the steaming coffee into my favorite ceramic mug and sat in the wicker rocking chair by the living room window. I turned on my little transistor radio at a very low volume, tuning into a local station playing old boleros. The contrast between the absolute peace of my living room and the storm that was about to unleash at that airline counter gave me a profound, almost poetic satisfaction. I knew the hit wouldn't take long. The flight was scheduled for 6 a.m., which meant they had to check their bags by 5 at the latest. In the county archive, I learned that bureaucratic timing is exact. When a system detects an anomaly, no amount of crying or begging matters. The machine simply stops and spits reality right in your face. At exactly 5:12 a.m., the landline phone on the corner table began to ring. The shrill chime cut through the melodious sound of the bolero. I didn't move right away. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down my throat. The phone kept ringing. 1, 2, 3, 4 rings. On the 5th, I stood up calmly, walked over to the side table, picked up the heavy plastic receiver, and brought it to my ear. I didn't say a word. "Mom? Mom, for God's sake, answer." Barbara's voice on the other end of the line was a cocktail of high-pitched hysteria and pure panic. In the background, I could clearly hear the metallic echo of the airport, the recorded voice of a woman announcing gate departures, and the incessant murmur of hundreds of people standing in line. "Good morning, Barbara. What a miracle you're calling so early," I replied, using the neutral, polite tone I reserved for furious citizens coming to complain about a misspelled certificate. "Mom, there is a massive problem," she screamed, and I could practically see the vein in her neck bulging with desperation. "We are at the airline counter. The idiot agent says our reservation was canceled last night, that the bank rejected the payment and blocked the tickets for suspected fraud. The cards are declining everything." "Well, what an unpleasant setback," I said, without altering my tone a single millimeter. "It's a disaster. The whole line is staring at us. The kids are hysterical. You need to call your bank right now, Mom. Tell them it was a system error, that you authorized the charge. Tell them to unblock the card so they can run the payment again. The flight closes in half an hour." I pushed my glasses up the bridge of my nose and looked out the window as the sky began to tint a pale gray. "But there is no error, Barbara. The bank did exactly what I asked them to do. I was the one who filed the report for unauthorized use and fraud. That card is destroyed, and the charge for your vacation was permanently denied. A graveyard silence fell over the line. It was so profound that for a second, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard my daughter's ragged breathing, followed by an incredulous stammer. What? You canceled the payment on purpose? Paper never lies, sweetheart. You used my primary account data behind my back. Off the record, you called it a forced loan or an advance on your inheritance. Officially, and in the eyes of financial institutions, it's called theft. I just put the paperwork in order. Are you fucking kidding me? Barbara exploded, completely losing any remaining trace of composure. You are ruining my vacation. Pay for it right now, Mom. Do a wire transfer. Give them another card number. Do something. I can't do that. At my age, I'm just too old to deal with the stress of urgent wire transfers at the crack of dawn. I handed her own words back to her with the precision of a scalpel. Besides, if I called the bank to say I authorized a fraud, I'd be the criminal. And in 71 years, my citizen record is spotless. Suddenly, I heard a scuffle on the line, and my son-in-law's thick but trembling voice took over. Diane? Good morning. It's Stephen, he said, trying to sound conciliatory, though his fear was palpable. Look, Mom, be reasonable. The kids are crying. We have the bags right here. If you just do us the favor of paying right now, I'll sign a promissory note. I'll pawn my car, whatever you want. But please, don't make us go through this public humiliation. Stephen, I cut him off firmly. You are a 45-year-old man. If you don't want to go through public humiliation, pull out your own credit card and pay for your wife and children's vacation. It's that simple. There was another humiliating silence. I knew perfectly well that Stephen's cards were maxed out from his bad business deals, and that he didn't even have enough to pay for a bus ticket to the capital, much less a luxury package to Maui. Barbara snatched the phone back. She was crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, of infantile frustration. You are a terrible mother, she shrieked with all her might. I hate you. You're leaving us stranded here like trash. The vacation is over before it even started. Barbara, pick up your designer suitcases and go back to your house. Have a safe drive back on the freeway. I placed the receiver softly back onto its cradle. The dry click severed my daughter's screams instantly. I stood there for a moment, feeling my heart beating just a little faster, but filled with a vital energy I hadn't experienced in years. The silent execution of my plan had been a resounding success. I didn't need to raise my voice, make a scene, or fight in the street. A simple bureaucratic procedure, executed with a cool head, had demolished her house of cards. I finished my coffee and walked toward my bedroom. I knew this wouldn't end with a simple phone call. Barbara was proud, stubborn, and used to getting her way. The airport was a 40-minute drive away, and I was absolutely certain that instead of going home to unpack in silence, she would come straight to my house seeking revenge. I went to the bathroom, took a quick, warm shower, and dressed with the utmost care. I chose a raw linen dress, impeccably tailored, the same one I used to wear for the official ceremonies, when handing over the archives to a new mayor. I brushed my silver hair until it lay perfectly in place. I dabbed on a little lavender perfume and painted my lips a subtle but firm red. If I was going to face a storm, I was going to do it looking like the absolute master of the weather. I went back to the living room, turned on the porch lights, and opened the heavy mahogany door, leaving only the wrought iron security gate locked between the entrance and the street. That gate, with its scrolls rusted by the sea breeze, would be my customer service counter. I sat on the sofa, back perfectly straight, my wristwatch in plain sight, and I waited. It was 6:15 when I heard the violent screech of tires braking hard against my curb. Then, the passenger door slamming echoed like a gunshot in the quiet street. Heavy, hurried footsteps pounded up the walkway, followed by a frantic rattling against the iron gate. Mom! Open this door! I stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my dress, and walked toward the entrance. Barbara was standing on the other side of the bars. Her appearance was a monumental disaster. She was wearing a printed silk beach outfit and a wide-brimmed straw hat that made her look completely ridiculous in the middle of our neighborhood's morning fog. Her makeup had run from tears of fury, staining her cheeks black, and she was panting hoarsely. Behind her, by the car parked halfway up the curb, Stephen stared at the ground with his hands in his pockets, unable to step closer. The kids hadn't even gotten out of the vehicle. "This is my house, Barbara, and in my house there is no screaming," I said, stopping 3 feet from the gate, my hands clasped in front of me. "You humiliated me," she screamed, gripping the iron bars with hands adorned in rings. The manager at the counter cut the cards in half with scissors right in front of everyone. Everyone was laughing at us. We had to walk all the way back to the parking lot dragging those bags like we were starving beggars. "You humiliated yourself the moment you decided to steal from me," I replied, keeping my voice level, refusing to let her hysteria infect me. "I merely protected myself. The consequences of your actions are entirely your own." Barbara shook the gate hard, making the metal screech. Her face was red, disfigured by a sense of wounded superiority she couldn't process. To her, I was an extension of her property, an ATM with a pulse that had suddenly refused to dispense cash. "You are a bitter, selfish old woman," she spat, lacing her words with venom. "You're going to rot alone in this giant house with your old papers and your illnesses. That's why nobody can stand you. You're going to pay me back every single penny of the embarrassment you put me through today." I let her vent. I watched her tantrum with the same clinical detachment I used to watch a rookie clerk complain about the filing system. When people run out of valid arguments, they resort to physical and emotional insults. It's a predictable pattern. "Are you finished?" I asked softly when I saw her gasp for air. She stared at me, eyes wide, totally thrown off by my lack of reaction. She expected me to cry, to unlock the gate, to beg for forgiveness for being a terrible mother. "No, I am not finished," she hissed, pressing her face against the bars with a twisted, malicious smile that turned my stomach. "You thought you were so clever today, Mom. But you forgot one massive detail. You are out of your mind. You've clearly lost a screw from old age. I am going to the notary today. I have absolute power over you. I am going to declare you mentally incompetent due to senility. I am going to take control of your accounts, this house, everything. I am going to throw you in a state nursing home so you learn your place." There it was. The final threat. The trump card she believed she had hidden up her sleeve. Barbara was convinced that the power of attorney was her guarantee of impunity, the perfect tool to subdue a rebellious old woman. I looked her dead in the eye. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a profound pity for the empty, miserable woman she had become. I took a step forward, standing mere inches from her, separated only by cold iron. "Arthur sends his regards, Barbara," I said in a clear, cutting whisper. The notary's name made her blink. The malicious smile vanished from her face instantly, replaced by a shadow of doubt. "What? What does Arthur have to do with this?" she stammered, slowly loosening her grip on the bars. "Yesterday afternoon, right after canceling the cards at the bank, I stopped by the notary's office. I permanently and irrevocably revoked the legal, financial, and medical power of attorney I had granted you. The document has already been entered into the state system. Furthermore, I amended my will. This house now has a life estate clause. You cannot sell it, mortgage it, or use it as collateral. You are no longer my legal proxy. You are not my guardian, and you no longer have any power over my life, my decisions, or my money." Barbara took a step back, as if I had slapped her. Her mouth opened slightly, trying to formulate a response, but the words wouldn't come. The thick morning air seemed to choke her. Suddenly, reality crashed down on her with the weight of a steel vault. She was standing in front of a 71-year-old woman who had just completely disarmed her, blocking every exit, locking every legal and financial door she intended to use to destroy me. "No, you can't do that. You're my mother," she muttered, her voice breaking, seeking one last refuge in the blood ties she herself had trampled on the day before. "I am your mother. Yes, but I am not your employee, nor your personal bank, nor an old piece of furniture you can toss in the basement when it gets in your way." I adjusted the collar of my dress and looked her up and down, mirroring the exact evaluative gesture she had used on me in her living room. "You are an adult woman, Barbara. It's time you start supporting yourself and paying for your own luxuries. And if you want a vacation, I suggest you start saving, because long trips cost a lot of money." I turned around, turning my back to her. "Mom, don't leave me like this, Mom!" She started screaming again, pounding on the gate, But this time her voice had no authority, only desperation. I walked back into my house. I didn't rush. I reached the heavy mahogany door. I turned one last time to look at her unhinged face through the wrought iron, and I gave her a polite, courtly nod. "Have an excellent day, sweetheart." I pushed the door, and the sound of the solid wood slotting into the frame echoed like the definitive closing of a heavy file. I threw both deadbolts. Barbara's screams turned into a muffled echo, drowned out by the thick walls of my house. I walked back to my living room. The bolero was still playing on the transistor radio, filling the space with its soft, melancholic notes. I walked over to my desk and ran my hand over the printed flight itinerary that would travel with me to Madrid. The silent execution was complete. The pieces had been swept off the board. Now all that was left was to enjoy the new landscape opening up before me. A landscape where my old age wasn't a death sentence, but the most powerful weapon I had ever wielded. The echo of the slamming door kept bouncing around in my mind, but it wasn't a bothersome sound. It was the sound of a file closing forever. I stood in the foyer of my house, breathing in the scent of beeswax from the furniture and the lavender of my perfume. The morning was just starting to heat up the streets of our coastal city, and I had the whole day ahead of me. I walked toward the kitchen with the unhurried grace of someone who owes nothing to life or to men. I prepared a breakfast worthy of a free woman. I sliced fresh papaya, toasted rustic bread, and poured another cup of black coffee. I sat at the dining room table, in the exact same chair where, 24 hours earlier, I had discovered my own daughter's theft. It felt like an entire decade had passed. As I chewed the sweet fruit, I turned on my old transistor radio. A velvet-voiced announcer read the local news and the weather forecast. It would be hot and humid. The sea breeze would bring passing clouds in the afternoon. A perfect day. My mind, trained for 40 years among the shelves of the county archive, began to classify the new situation. In bureaucracy, just as in life, power does not reside with the one who screams the loudest, but with the one who holds the stamps and the signatures. Barbara had lived her entire adult life under a delusion, believing that her youth and explosive temper made her superior to me. She mistook my maternal silence for submission, but an archivist's silence is never empty. It is the space where we observe, read, and document the failures of others. Just past 9 in the morning, I decided I wasn't going to stay locked inside, waiting for aftershocks from an earthquake I had caused myself. I grabbed my leather purse, checked that my wallet and keys were in place, and walked out to the street. I wanted to walk under the sun, to feel the weight of my own independence. My neighborhood streets were full of life. Women were sweeping the sidewalks, dogs dozed under the shade of the almond trees, and street vendors hawked sweetbread and tamales from their tricycles. I walked with my back straight, greeting my longtime neighbors with a nod. I reached the small covered market 6 blocks from my house. The smell of fresh cilantro, roasted peppers, and fish, straight from the harbor, filled my lungs. I stopped at Mr. Philemon's fruit stand. As I was picking out some lemons and avocados, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Diane, what a miracle seeing you here so early." I turned around and found Carol, a former colleague from the county office. Carol had been the secretary for the Public Works Department. She was a sharp woman, with small, curious eyes, who was always clued in to the movements of the entire town. "Good morning, Carol. The weather is lovely for grocery shopping," I replied with a serene smile. Carol stepped a little closer, dropping her voice as if we were about to share a state secret. "Listen, a little while ago I saw your daughter Barbara driving down the main avenue. She was in her car, driving like a bat out of hell, and she had her husband and the kids with her. They had faces like they were going to a funeral. Weren't they supposed to be leaving for a beach trip today? A traditional mother's natural instinct would have been to cover for her daughter, invent a medical excuse or a flight issue to protect the family image. But I had resigned from that role the moment Barbara declared me too old to have dreams. There was a change of plans, Carol," I said, choosing my words with the precision of a notary. "It turns out the vacation Barbara had planned didn't have the proper financial backing. The bank rejected the payments due to irregularities, so they'll have to stay home and reflect on the importance of doing things legally." Carol's eyes went wide, processing the elegance with which I had just called my own daughter a fraud. Her secretary's mind caught the hidden message instantly. She nodded slowly, with a mix of respect and awe. "I understand perfectly, Diane. Debts are terrible advisors. What a shame for them. But I'm so glad you're at peace. You look great, by the way. You have a different glow about you. I feel excellent, Carol. I'm getting my own paperwork in order. I'm going on a trip next week. We said goodbye with a brief hug. I paid for my fruit and walked back home, feeling that every step affirmed my sovereignty. By not hiding the truth, I had cut off any chance for Barbara to play the victim in our social circle. If she tried to say I was a crazy, bitter old woman, people would already know that the real issue was a matter of money and declined accounts. The morning passed in a delicious peace. I spent a couple of hours checking the potted plants on my back patio, watering the ferns and pruning the dead leaves from my rose bushes. I ate a light lunch and sat in my study to mentally review my packing list. It was exactly 4 p.m. when the bell at the front gate rang timidly. It wasn't the hysterical pounding from the morning. It was a short, almost fearful sound. I peeked through the living room window, pulling back the lace curtain just a fraction. On the other side of the gate stood Stephen. He was alone. His posture was that of a defeated man. Shoulders slumped, hands clasped in front of him, eyes glued to the sidewalk tiles. I didn't go out immediately. I let him wait a couple of minutes under the relentless coastal afternoon sun. Let him feel the heat. Let him sweat his guilt. Finally, I walked toward the front door, opened it, and stood on the threshold, making no attempt to walk closer to the iron gate to open it. "Good afternoon, Stephen," I said, projecting my voice so it carried clearly to the street. He looked up, squinting against the glare of the sun. "Diane, I'm so sorry to bother you again. Do you think we could talk for a minute? I promise I'll be brief. Barbara doesn't know I'm here." I evaluated him with my gaze. Stephen had always been a mediocre man, the kind who drifts with the current, who never makes important decisions, but who happily enjoys the luxuries when someone else foots the bill. His cowardice was his defining trait. "You can speak from right there, Stephen. I can hear you perfectly." He swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable having to beg through rusted bars in full view of any neighbor walking down the street. "Ma'am, we are in a critical situation," he began, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "The travel agency is demanding a $2,000 cancellation penalty. They say that because the payment bounced due to suspected bank fraud, the cancellation policy's changed. If we don't pay by tomorrow, they're going to send the case to collections and garnish my wages. I don't have that money. My cards are maxed out." I crossed my arms. The financial machine, when activated against cheaters, is ruthless and beautiful. That is an unfortunate situation, without a doubt, but I fail to see what it has to do with me. I didn't sign any contract with that agency. "Please, Mom." He used that familiar title that I always found detestable. "I know Barbara acted poorly. It was a terrible mistake. She is devastated at home. She won't stop crying. I told her not to use your card, but she insisted you'd understand. I'm just asking for a loan. $2,000. I'll pay you back month by month. If they garnish my wages, I won't have enough to feed your grandchildren." Emotional blackmail, the final card of the mediocre, using the grandkids as human shields to evade the consequences of their actions. I walked slowly down the exterior walkway until I was 3 feet from the gate. I looked at him with the coldness of a judge handing down a sentence. "Stephen, throughout my career in the archive, I saw hundreds of men like you. Men who sign documents without reading them, who allow fraud out of convenience, and who, when the audit comes, blame their wives or use their children to evoke pity. Do not call me Mom. I am Diane." He lowered his head, humiliated by the harshness of my words. "You have a $2,000 debt for a trip you couldn't afford," I continued, listing the facts on my fingers. "Your wife took my primary account data, forged my authorization on a web portal, and intended to spend $8,000 of my life savings. Money I gathered working every single day of my life. Money she justified by saying, 'I'm a decrepit old woman who no longer has the right to live, and you come here to ask me to pay the fine for her crime. It's just that if you don't help us, we're going to be ruined,'" he mumbled, his eyes watering. "Ruin is the place where irresponsible adults learn math, Stephen. I suggest you sell that car you were driving this morning, or have Barbara sell her designer swimsuits and new suitcases." He shook his head in despair. "That won't cover it. Please, Diane. You have more than enough money. Don't be cruel." The word cruel sparked a flash of indignation inside me, but I extinguished it immediately with my usual discipline. I took one more step, closing the distance to the bars. I'm going to show you something, Stephen. Wait right here. I turned around and went back inside the house. I walked into my study, grabbed the blue binder resting on my desk, and walked back out to the porch. I stood in front of him and opened the binder. I pulled out 2 printed sheets of paper and showed them to him through the gate. The first page was my international flight itinerary. "Read this out loud," I ordered. Stephen squinted to focus on the black letters against the white paper. "Direct flight to Madrid. Premium economy class. Passenger, Diane. Departure next Thursday." His voice trailed off at the end of the sentence. He looked up, staring at me with a mix of absolute shock and terror. "Barbara told you both that I was too old to travel, that a long flight would destroy me. Well, it turns out my bones are in perfect condition, and so is my bank account. I am going to Spain for 3 weeks. I paid for this trip with the exact same money you two tried to steal from me." Stephen blinked, unable to tear his eyes away from the printed page. The silence between us was only broken by the distant song of the cicadas announcing the afternoon heat. "And this second page," I continued, sliding the itinerary back to show him the notarized document with the thick state seals, the certified copy of the revocation of power of attorney, and the amendment to my will. "Paperwork I completed yesterday afternoon with Arthur. It stipulates here that this house is untouchable, and that Barbara no longer has any legal, medical, or financial authority over my person. The faucet has been shut off permanently, Stephen." My son-in-law's face lost whatever little color it had left. He instantly understood what those papers meant. Not only were they out of a luxury vacation, but the financial life raft they were used to clinging to every time their irresponsibility drowned them had just been punctured and sunk beyond repair. "Diane, for the love of God," he stammered, taking a step back as if the documents were burning him. "God has no jurisdiction over the cancellation policies of travel agencies, Stephen. I suggest you go to a bank first thing tomorrow, take out a personal loan in your name, pay your $2,000 penalty, and start living like the 45-year-old adult you're supposed to be. Tell your wife that the file on her tantrums has been classified as case closed. Have a good afternoon." I didn't give him time to utter another word. I put the papers back in my blue binder, turned around, and walked up the walkway to the mahogany door of my house. I went inside, locked it, and didn't look out the window. I heard Stephen's dragging footsteps shuffling away down the sidewalk, and minutes later, the heavy sound of his car engine starting up. The following days passed with a serenity I hadn't experienced in decades. I dedicated myself to preparing for my trip with my characteristic meticulousness. I went to the pharmacy to fill my preventative prescriptions. I bought a couple of power adapters for Europe, and I made sure to leave all the household bills paid in advance. At the market, the looks of pity that some might have expected toward the poor, abandoned old woman were glaringly absent. Carol, with her undeniable talent for broadcasting accurate information, had set the record straight in the neighborhood. People greeted me with a renewed respect. I had ceased to be the docile grandmother and had become the woman who allowed no one, not even her own blood, to disrespect her. On Thursday morning, the taxi arrived at my door at 5 on the dot. The driver, a polite young man, loaded my brown leather suitcase into the trunk. As I settled into the back seat, I looked at my house with its white walls and red roof tiles. It was safe, protected by the laws I had personally activated. We arrived at the international airport just before 6. The building, with its massive glass windows and cold steel structure, was the exact same stage where, just days prior, Barbara had put on her spectacle of fury and humiliation. I walked across the same polished granite floor, calmly pushing my suitcase. There was no screaming, no bounced debts, no cards cut with scissors in front of a mocking crowd. I reached the airline counter. A uniformed young woman greeted me with a professional smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Passport and flight confirmation, please." I handed her my passport, a little book with pristine pages that had been waiting years for this moment, and the printout of my reservation. The young woman typed the data into her computer. There were no red flashing lights, no calls to the manager, no looks of panic. Just the soft whir of the machine printing my boarding pass. "Everything is in order, Diane. Your luggage is checked straight through to Madrid. You'll be boarding at gate 12. Have a wonderful trip." I took the boarding pass like someone receiving a diploma. The paper was thick, real. I walked toward the security checkpoints, feeling that with every step I was leaving behind the prejudices, the limitations, and the labels that society and my own daughter had tried to stitch into my clothes. The flight took 12 hours. 12 hours in which, contrary to Barbara's catastrophic predictions, my back was not destroyed, my blood pressure remained as stable as a Swiss watch, and my ears suffered nothing more than a mild, passing discomfort that was solved by chewing a mint candy. Premium economy turned out to be extremely comfortable. I enjoyed 2 glasses of red wine, a couple of classic movies, and slept deeply tucked under a blanket, lulled by the constant hum of the turbines. When the plane landed at Barajas Airport and the wheels touched Spanish asphalt, I felt a wave of emotion that moistened my eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was the pure, overwhelming confirmation that I was alive. Madrid welcomed me with a deep blue sky and dry air that contrasted deliciously with the sticky humidity of my coastal town. During the first week, I dedicated myself to walking. I strolled down the Paseo del Prado. I sat on the benches in Retiro Park to watch people go by, and I ate tapas in bustling markets, always ordering a glass of sherry. I discovered that youth is not a strict requirement for wonder. In fact, old age grants you a marvelous pause, the ability to observe the details of architecture and life without the urgent need to prove anything to anyone. But the true purpose of my trip, the climax of my transformation, happened in my second week when I took a high-speed train to Seville. As a former archivist, I had a personal pilgrimage to make. The General Archive of the Indies, that majestic, solemn Renaissance building, took my breath away. When I walked into its galleries and caught that unmistakable scent of antique paper, cured parchment, and the dust of centuries, I felt at home. I walked among the display cases, showing documents from the 1500s, letters signed by kings and navigators, maps drawn by hand with inks that refused to fade. I stopped in front of a manuscript dated 1540. The calligraphy was intricate, elegant, and firm. I thought of the man or woman who had traced those letters nearly 500 years ago. That paper had survived wars, fires, the relentless passage of time. It had become more valuable precisely because of its antiquity. No one would walk into that archive and say those documents were too old to be useful. On the contrary, their age was their greatest virtue, their guarantee of authenticity and wisdom. In that moment of stillness, surrounded by the written history of the world, I understood my own value. I was not a balance in a bank account, nor an obstacle in my daughter's life. I was a living archive. My wrinkles, my white hair, my measured way of walking were the physical proofs of a woman who had survived widowhood, 40 years of exhausting work, and the raising of a difficult daughter. My age wasn't an expiration date. It was my seal of authenticity. I spent 3 wonderful weeks in Spain. I made friends on day trips to Toledo and Segovia. I conversed with people of all ages who didn't view me as a burden, but as an independent traveler. I bought meaningful souvenirs, not cheap plastic or gaudy beachwear, but a beautiful black lace mantilla, a carved silver thimble for my desk collection, and a small olive wood box with geometric inlays. The trip back was just as serene. When I finally opened the mahogany door of my house on the coast, the smell of furniture wax and the thick street air welcomed me back. I turned on the old ceiling fan, left my suitcase in the hallway, and took a deep breath. I had returned to the exact same place, but I was a completely different woman. The days following my return brought me the final pieces of news I needed to close the file. Carol came to visit one afternoon for coffee and brought the summary of local events. It turns out the travel agency, upon not receiving the penalty payment, had initiated an aggressive legal process. To avoid having his wages garnished, Stephen and Barbara had to sell the new SUV she loved to show off so much. They sold it fast and at a loss, but that wasn't all. Since their cards remained blocked, and I had completely shut off the valve to my savings, Barbara had no choice but to face reality. "She got a job, Diane," Carol told me, taking a sip of her black coffee, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "She started as a receptionist at a dental clinic downtown. She has to clock in at 8 in the morning and put up with patients all day. Word is, she almost quit the first day because her feet hurt. But since they have to pay the kids' private school tuition, she had no other option." I nodded slowly, showing no mockery or malicious joy. I only felt the profound satisfaction of poetic justice. Barbara had belittled my 40 years of work as an archivist, assuming my money appeared by magic, and that she had the right to spend it, because I was too old to use it. Now, she herself would have to wake up early, force a smile, deal with the public, and learn exactly how much it cost to earn every single $20 bill. The lesson was underway, and life, which is the greatest teacher of all, would be in charge of grading it. I didn't call her, and she didn't look for me either. I knew her wounded pride and resentment would keep her away for a good while, maybe years, and that was perfectly fine. I no longer needed the validation of a selfish daughter to feel my life had purpose. I had let go of the toxic guilt that ties so many mothers to the abuse of their adult children. One Sunday afternoon, the heat was particularly intense. The bougainvillea on the porch was in full bloom, a nearly violent fuchsia. I sat in my study, surrounded by my shelves full of acid-free folders and perfectly labeled boxes. I picked up my tortoiseshell fountain pen and wiped it with a cotton cloth, enjoying the gleam of the material. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I keep locked, and pulled out a new folder. It wasn't blue or gray like the ones for legal paperwork. It was a dark green folder. On the tab, in my best handwriting, I wrote the word life. Inside the folder, I carefully placed my boarding passes, the train tickets to Seville, the entrance ticket to the General Archive of the Indies, and a couple of printed photographs of me smiling in front of the royal palace, my silver hair shining under the Spanish sun, and my shoulders relaxed. Then, I took a different rubber stamp from my display case. This one was smaller, with a polished mahogany handle. I pressed it against the black ink pad and stamped it firmly on the inside cover of the folder. I lifted the wood and read the words stamped on the paper: archived. I had classified the pain, the betrayal, and the manipulation exactly where they belonged, in the past. My present belonged entirely to me. I had discovered that power does not reside in youth, nor in the volume of your voice, nor in the ability to intimidate. True power resides in strategic silence, in knowing your own resources, and in the absolute refusal to be invisible. I leaned back in my swivel chair, turned off the small brass lamp, and let the orange light of the sunset flood my sanctuary. At 71 years old, my file was just beginning to fill with the brightest pages of my existence, proving that no woman is ever too old to travel, to defend herself, or to write her own happy ending.